The morning had begun like any other for the rancher, with the crisp bite of dawn air filling his lungs as he guided the wagon across the pasture, the wooden wheels creaking under the weight of the hay stacked high, golden strands swaying with each jolt of the dirt road, and though the sky glowed faintly pink with the promise of a new day, there was nothing in his heart but the ordinary rhythm of tending cattle, for he had long grown used to the solitude of his land. The silence broken only by the lowing of cows and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. And yet, on this particular day, the air felt heavier, as if the land itself held its breath, waiting, watching, carrying a tension that he could not yet name. He pulled the reins, urging his horse to halt at the barn, the animals stirring hungrily behind the wooden slats, their noses pressed eagerly through the gaps. But as he reached for the first bale of hay, muscles straining against the rough rope, that bound it, he froze. Not because of what he saw, but because of what he heard. A sound so faint it seemed at first like a trick of the wind, a whisper threading itself through the dry rustle of hay, so soft he almost dismissed it, until it came again, urgent, trembling, carrying words that chilled him to the bone. "Don't speak. He'll kill us both." The rancher stiffened, every sense sharpening in an instant, his heart hammering against his ribs like the hooves of a frightened colt, and slowly, with a mix of disbelief and dread, he turned his head toward the towering stack of hay, his eyes narrowing at the subtle shift of straw as though something or someone moved beneath. Sweat broke across his brow despite the cool of the morning as his mind raced, for he lived alone, had expected no visitors, and in all his years he had never heard a human voice drift from the very feed meant for his cattle. And yet here it was, a woman's voice, raw, desperate, carrying the tremor of someone who had already suffered too much. His first instinct was to call out, to demand who she was and why she was there, but the sharp warning in her words held him back, the way she had hissed, "Don't speak," with such terror that he felt his throat close, as if uttering even a breath too loud might summon a nightmare into existence. And so he crouched, moving the hay with slow, deliberate hands, careful not to draw attention to himself, though every fiber of his being screamed to act faster. Then, as the strands shifted, he saw her. The pale face of a woman, dirt and blood streaked across her skin, her eyes wide with fear, yet burning with the stubborn flame of someone clinging to life, her wrists bound cruelly with rope, her dress torn and dust-stained, and though her lips barely moved, the words poured into him like poison. "He's watching, always watching. If he knows you found me, he'll kill us before sundown." The rancher's breath caught, his chest tightening as he glanced instinctively toward the barn doors, toward the open field beyond, and for the first time he noticed how exposed he was, how the land rolled away with no cover, how easy it would be for a rifle barrel to glint from the hills, unseen eyes hidden in the folds of the horizon. The realization struck like lightning. Someone had hidden her here, someone cruel enough to starve her beneath the very hay meant for cattle, and someone confident enough to believe she would not be discovered. And now, by stumbling upon her, he had stepped into a trap he did not understand. His mind wrestled with questions. Who was she? How long had she been here? And who was this he she feared so deeply? But answers would have to wait, for every second stretched taut with danger, every sound amplified. The restless snort of his horse, the impatient bellow of a cow, the faint creak of wood settling in the barn rafters, any of which might betray them if the watcher truly lingered nearby. He swallowed hard, lowering himself closer, his voice a mere breath as he dared to whisper, "What's your name?" But she shook her head violently, eyes flashing with a warning so sharp it silenced him, and instead she mouthed a single word he barely caught. "Quiet." His stomach knotted as the weight of her terror sank in. This was no passing threat, no empty fear, but the kind born from knowing, from living under the shadow of a predator who held power over life and death. The rancher, though no stranger to hardship, had never faced such invisible menace, and the urge to bolt, to flee the barn and pretend he had never heard her, fought against the steady pull of his conscience, the part of him that could not ignore. Suffering, that could not leave a soul to die beneath hay, as if she were no more than another beast of burden. Yet even as resolve hardened within him, he knew one wrong move could end them both. And so he forced his shaking hands to continue their ordinary task, tossing hay into the trough as though nothing were amiss, while beneath the shifting pile, the woman trembled, her every breath a plea for survival, her every glance darting toward the door as though expecting her captor to appear at any moment. And outside, the silence of the land pressed tighter, as if holding back a storm poised to break. The rancher realized then that this was not his routine morning, not a simple feeding of cattle, but the first step into a deadly game where silence was the only shield and discovery the certain end, and as he lifted another bale, his ears straining for the faintest sound beyond the barn, he understood that the question was no longer whether he could help her. It was whether they could survive long enough to escape the gaze of the unseen killer already drawing near. The rancher had always trusted his land, for in its wide stretches of dust and grass, in the endless horizon that stretched unbroken beneath the sun, there had never been cause for suspicion. And yet that morning, as he drove the wagon heavy, with hay toward the barn, a feeling of unease stirred in his gut. Subtle at first, like the shift of wind before a storm, then heavier, pressing down on him as he dismounted and began his work. And though his cattle bawled hungrily, their impatience, echoing off the wooden beams, he couldn't shake the sense that he was not alone, that unseen eyes tracked his every movement. He told himself it was foolishness, the paranoia of a man too long isolated on his ranch. But when he tugged loose the first bundle of hay and saw strands scattered across the ground in patterns that made no sense, as though someone had crawled or thrashed within it, his heart gave a hard, warning thud, and when his hand brushed against a torn scrap of fabric half buried beneath the straw, delicate, feminine, out of place among the dust and dirt, the air left his lungs in a rush. His body suddenly rigid, and then he heard it, faint but undeniable, the sound of breathing, shallow, muffled, coming from within the stack itself, and before his fear could fully form, a voice, fragile as paper, broke the silence, trembling yet laced with terror that clawed into his bones. "Don't! Don't speak. He'll kill us both." The rancher froze, his hands tightening around the bale, his mind reeling at the impossible reality of a woman's voice spilling from the very hay meant for cattle. And slowly, as though the slightest sudden move might unleash catastrophe, he lowered the bundle, his eyes darting across the barn to the open door, to the expanse of land that had always felt safe, but now looked like a hunting ground where he stood exposed, a target waiting for a bullet. He swallowed, his throat dry as sand, his thoughts racing. Who was she? How had she come to be here? And who was the he that shadowed her every word with such dread? He wanted to answer, to reassure, but her whisper had carried more than fear. It had carried a warning, sharp and desperate, a command born not of madness, but of survival. And so he forced himself into silence, his breath shallow, his ears straining, beyond the pounding of his own heart, and that was when he noticed it. The stillness outside was wrong, the kind of silence too deliberate, too heavy, as though nature itself dared not betray that something, or someone, watched from beyond sight. A chill trickled down his spine as he realized that if she was right, if she was truly being kept here, then her captor could be close, hidden in the shadows of the hills, perhaps crouched even now with rifle steady, waiting for him to make a sound, to expose that he had discovered her. His muscles trembled with the effort of restraint, every instinct screaming to demand answers, to rip open the hay and drag her free, but he knew, he felt it in his marrow, that haste would mean death, and so, pretending at normalcy, he tossed hay into the trough, his movements careful, deliberate, though sweat dampened his back. And each time the hay shifted, he glimpsed her eyes beneath, wide and pleading, filled with a fear so raw it bled into him, as though her very soul begged him to understand the peril they were in. He could see her bruises, the rope that still bit into her wrists, the dirt smeared across her cheeks. And yet what haunted him most was not her suffering, but the certainty in her gaze, the knowledge of a predator who lingered always near, who toyed with her life as a cat toys with a mouse, who might even now be watching them both from the shadows. The rancher felt the weight of those unseen eyes pressing against his skin, and as he lifted another bale, his hands trembling despite his effort to appear steady, he realized that he had stepped into something far larger, far darker than he had ever imagined. This was no simple rescue, no chance discovery, but the beginning of a silent war against an enemy who knew the land better than anyone, an enemy who used fear as his weapon and silence as his snare. And if the rancher dared one wrong move, one wrong word, then the fields he had always called home would become their graves before the sun ever set. The rancher had risen that morning with nothing more pressing on his mind than the endless chores that bound a man to the land, the kind of duties that dulled into routine, mending a broken fence post, feeding the cattle, hauling bales of hay, from the wagon to the trough. But by the time the sun stretched high and poured its glare over the wide, dry fields, he would come to realize that every ordinary step he had taken had been leading him toward a discovery so dreadful that even the soil beneath his boots seemed to tremble with it. For as he entered the barn, muscles straining with the weight of hay on his shoulders, he noticed something wrong. Not obvious, not screaming its presence, but a whisper of disturbance in the air, a faint wrongness etched into the silence. The kind of silence that doesn't settle naturally but is forced, suffocating, like a lid pressed down over life itself, and though he tried to push the unease aside, the feeling grew heavier with each bundle he lifted, until, at last, the sound reached him. Barely more than the rustle of straw, the shallow flutter of lungs that should not have been there, and when he froze, listening harder, he heard it. Again, a breath, ragged, stifled, buried within the very hay he was meant to feed his herd. And then, as his heart thudded loud enough he feared it might give them away, the voice came, fragile, yet burning with desperation, whispering up through the straw. "Please, don't move too quick. Don't let him hear us. He'll kill us both." For a moment the rancher thought he was imagining it, that loneliness and long days had finally cracked his mind. But then the hay shifted ever so slightly, and two terrified eyes blinked up at him through the shadows, wide and pleading, their whites stark against the grime and bruises that marred her face. And in that instant the rancher understood. This woman was real, trapped, hiding, and whoever had put her there had done so with the intent that she remain silent, unseen, until fate itself carried her body away, and the thought twisted in his gut with a sickening clarity, because she wasn't whispering warnings for her sake alone. She was warning him too. Every instinct screamed to pull her free, to demand who had done this and why. But she shook her head frantically from within the hay, lips barely parting, and mouthed again, "Not yet." And that was when he noticed what she meant. For outside the barn, past the slats of weather-worn wood, a shadow lingered, moving just out of reach. And though he could not see the man clearly, he felt the weight of his presence like a loaded gun pressed to the back of his skull, a presence patient and watchful, content to let the rancher stumble into a trap of his own making, for the captor had no need to rush. He had already spun. His snare already trained his eyes and perhaps even his rifle on this place, and any sound, any sudden act, would bring his wrath crashing down upon them. The rancher's mouth dried, his thoughts racing, his body caught between stillness and panic, as the woman's whisper wound deeper into him. She told him, in words so faint they trembled like the wings of a moth, that her tormentor had bound her wrists, hidden her beneath the hay, and sat waiting, always waiting, never far, and that he enjoyed it, enjoyed watching her squirm in silence, enjoyed the terror that gnawed at her as she prayed for someone, anyone, to stumble close enough to hear but not bold enough to act, because if they acted too soon, if they revealed they knew, the captor would strike, ruthless and merciless, with traps already laid and weapons already aimed. The rancher felt the weight of her warning crash against his chest, and suddenly the barn he had known all his life no longer belonged to him but to the invisible predator who had turned it into a theater of fear, and in that instant he realized the cruelest truth of all. He could not simply tear her free, could not storm out and confront the evil watching from the shadows, because the captor had already decided the rules of this game, rules written in silence and blood, and now the rancher had been pulled into them too, bound to the same deadly stillness, forced to play a part where one slip of the tongue, one desperate shout would mean both their lives snuffed out before hope could even flicker. The rancher had driven his wagon into the barn with the same calm he had carried all his life, the kind of weary calm a man wore after decades of dawn-to-dusk labor, where hauling hay for hungry cattle was as ordinary as breathing, but in the space of a heartbeat, that ordinary moment splintered into something he would never forget. For when he dragged the first heavy bale across the floor, a faint stirring came from the shadows beneath the stack, too delicate to belong to rats or strays, too sharp to be dismissed as the creak of wood. And when he leaned closer, ears straining, he heard it, the weak rasp of a woman's breath, the sound of someone fighting not to exist loudly enough to be found. And then, like a shard of glass through silence, came the whisper, trembling and urgent. "Don't speak. Don't let him hear you. He'll kill us both." In that instant, the rancher's blood turned cold, for no man expects to find a prisoner hidden in the very hay meant to feed his herd. Yet there she was, bruised, trembling, her eyes flashing, with the desperate fire of someone cornered between death and a sliver of hope, and as he bent slightly, torn between instinct to help and terror of what those words meant, he realized something that rooted him to the spot. The woman wasn't merely afraid of some faceless drifter or outlaw. Her fear carried the weight of familiarity, as though the monster who had caged her wasn't a stranger at all, but someone tied to this place, to these lands, to the town the rancher thought he knew. That thought gnawed at him, and when he dared, glanced toward the gaps in the barn wall, sunlight bleeding through in dusty beams, he caught the unmistakable shape of a man standing just beyond the light, not moving, not speaking, just watching, his outline too steady to be accidental, too deliberate to be anything but the shadow of the captor himself. And with that realization came the sickening truth. The barn was no longer his, the cattle no longer his, even the breath in his lungs no longer his, for every inch of the space had been claimed as a trap, a silent snare in which he now found himself caught beside the woman. She clutched at the hay as though it could swallow her whole again, her lips barely parting to whisper more, explaining that the man who had done this was not a wandering stranger, but someone who walked freely among their neighbors, someone who smiled and shook hands in daylight, who wore the face of respectability. But beneath that mask lived a cruelty that fed on silence, a cruelty that had turned her into a secret buried beneath straw and rope. The rancher's mind reeled as possibilities clawed at him. Who among them had such darkness hidden in his marrow? The blacksmith who shared whiskey with him after long days? The deputy who tipped his hat as if his conscience weighed clean? Or worse, someone closer, someone the rancher trusted with his land, his herd, his very livelihood? The woman's eyes widened, urging him not to let his thoughts betray him, not to let recognition show on his face, for the captor was near enough to see, near enough to sense any shift in the air, and in that terrible moment the rancher understood the cruel bind he was in. If he spoke, if he acted without cunning, the shadow outside would strike, and not just him, her too, silenced forever before anyone could know the truth, before the mask of the monster could be torn away. His chest tightened as he stood frozen, hay in his hands like a shield he dared not drop, every sound magnified. The creak of wood, the slow, grinding breath of cattle, the faint tremor of the woman beneath the straw. And though rage burned within him, it was shackled by the knowledge that any wrong move would trigger the violence coiled just beyond those barn doors. So he did the only thing a man could do when thrust into the jaws of a predator who wore a neighbor's skin. He pretended, forcing his body into the rhythm of chores, dragging hay as though nothing had changed, as though he hadn't heard the whispered plea, while every fiber of his being screamed to find a way, any way, to save the woman and expose the devil hiding behind a familiar face. And as the shadow shifted just enough to remind him of its patience, its certainty, the rancher knew that from this moment forward his life was no longer his own. It was bound to a deadly secret buried beneath the hay, a secret that could tear apart the thin trust holding their town together. And whether he walked out of this barn alive or not would depend entirely on how long he could play this silent game without letting the terror show in his eyes.